It doesn't take a genius to realize that something's gone wrong in the world, but it does take some understanding to realize what has gone wrong in the world. And everybody knows that something's gone wrong, but they have various solutions to it, right? So somebody says, well, we need to just be more liberating and more free, or we need more tolerance, or we need to go the other way, and we need to be less free, and then we need to be equal, and everybody has their solution of how to solve the problem. But in order for you to solve the problem, you have to understand what has actually gone wrong in the world so that you can address the solution, not just the symptoms of a issue. And the Bible is very clear as to what has gone wrong in the world. And the answer, to put it plainly, is sin. But more than that, the answer is that we as people have chosen not to worship God as the creator, and we've chosen to worship other things. At its very core, this is what has gone wrong with the world. Here's what we see in Romans chapter 1. Verse 21 says, "For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened." Verse 21 has a three-step process to it. It says that they didn't worship or honor God, and so they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. So as soon as you stop worshiping God, you become futile in your thinking, and your heart begins to harden towards the things of God. And verses 22 and 23 explain that what has happened, that people have chosen not to worship God, not to give glory to God, but to worship and give glory to other things. And so in your groups today, a couple of questions along verses 21, 22, and 23. In today's world, where do we see the creation worshiped rather than the creator God? And in our own lives, where do we see tendencies where we tend to not center our lives around God, but center our lives around what are those objects that we tend to center our lives around? And then he continues in verse 24, and he says, therefore, since man has decided not to worship God, but to worship created things, therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to this dishonoring other bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the creator God. This explains here that sometimes the wrath of God is not necessarily direct, and it's not necessarily forceful. Sometimes the wrath of God, or God's judgment, is him removing himself and saying, well, if that's the direction that you want to go, you go ahead and do that. It's verse 24, therefore God gave them up. And we're going to see in verse 26 the same kind of language, that it's God who gives them up. And so you think you know what's right, you think you know what's best, go ahead and do that, and it leads to destruction. The further that society, the further that the culture, the further that the world, the further an individual removes himself from God, it only pushes debauchery and sin. They begin to abound more and more, and it only exacerbates the problem and the issues that we see around us. So it's God giving them up. And then one of the clear examples of God's judgment and God's wrath is found in verse 27. Verse 27 says, "And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error." That all this rise of LGBT and all this rise of sexual immorality in our culture is just people who have decided, forget God, we're going to worship creation, we're going to worship even ourselves. Forget God, we're worshiping this, and God's judgment, God gives them up to that. And we see, as one of the results, an increase in that kind of sexual immorality and debauchery. Even, just an interesting side point, even the rainbow flag is such an interesting symbol, because if you remember, the rainbow was created, given by God to show a covenant between God and Noah right after God had judged the world. But a couple of questions for you as you look through verses 24 and 27. How do you view the wrath of God and judgment in light of Romans 1, and how did you view it before? And then the second one, do we see why it's so gracious of God when he convicts us of sin? When he doesn't just give us up into our sinful desires and our sinful lusts, but actually convicts us of sin. And then the last portion of Romans 1 here, verses 28 until the end, 28 says, they did not see fit to acknowledge God. And so again, we see the language, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. And then he lists in verses 29 and verse 30 and 31, he lists all these sins. And what's interesting there is you have murder, but you also have disobedience to parents, right? Talking about sin in the kind of way that sin is, all of it is evil before God. Even things that we look at and we say, well, that's pretty minor. To God, it's not minor. To God, it is a sin against his holy nature. And verse 32 says, not only do these people sin against God, they approve of others who sin against God. And that's why we see a rise online. You can literally, any kind of debauchery you can think of, people supporting one another in that kind of debauchery. And we see an increase of it. So questions there. Where have you seen this increase for support of sin? How do people, verse 32 says, how do people that know that those who practice the truth deserve to die, right? So read through verse 32, and how is it that those people know and yet they continue in their sin? And then lastly, the third question is, what is it that saves us from all of this, right? And the answer is very clear. It is the good news of Jesus Christ, that Jesus came so that we no longer are dead in our trespasses and sins. No longer are we given up, but God has come to redeem us and to restore us to himself. And as a result of that, now we have a chance at life, and life eternal, abundant, and everlasting, right? And so talk about that good news of Jesus in light of Romans chapter 1. Blessings to you.